I don't know about you, but when it gets to be this time of year, when there's a nip in the air that hints at fall, or since we're here in Houston, since the calendar just turns over to October, because there may not be a nip in the air until like January, so, we just have to kind of make do. You've got those calendars. Do you have those calendars that have pictures on it, and you flip it, and it's got the fall leaves, and it's beautiful, and you just love that picture, and then you look outside, and you're like, well, okay. But so I kind of miss the nip in the air that signals fall, but I don't know about you, but when this time of the year comes, all of a sudden I start to think about the holidays. I start to kind of prepare and get ready, and it's really not the shopping and the wrapping and the decorating part that I think about. In fact, those things kind of get in the way. It is the food and the wine and the candles and the music and all, if the rest of that didn't get in the way, that would be just fine. The laughter and family and everybody together, just something about this time of year and the joyous holiday celebration. Well, this year I'm especially excited because my daughter-in-law is driving for 2 days across country to bring her 2 young sons. But my son is overseas, so she is bringing her 2 young sons, my grandsons, to celebrate with her family and with my family for really the 30 days they're going to be here from Thanksgiving all the way through Christmas. So I'm very excited about it this year. And I started, of course, cleaning out cabinets and getting ready and looking at things. And I found some holly glasses in the back of my wine cabinet that are going to match my, my holly bowls that go with the soup and everything. It's just so perfect. And if it just weren't for that wrapping and decorating and, cooking part of it, it would all be just great. But I mentioned this at this time of year because the Hebrew people also had a rich tradition of celebrating. And this particular chapter that's centered around the Feast of Booths, we see that in this chapter. Chapter 7 of John opens with another festival, just as chapter 6 did. Chapter 6 opened with the festival of Passover. Now, there have been 6 months in between these 2 festivals, but both chapters open with a feast. This time of year for us as Catholics, we are also aware of that liturgical cycle because we are preparing to move out of ordinary time. We are preparing to move into Advent, and we are preparing to begin a new liturgical year. So we're also aware of that. The Jewish calendar was marked by several feast days, but 3 of them were considered very significant feast days. One in the spring, one in the early summer, and one in the fall. They were significant in that they were pilgrimage feasts, and that any male Jew that was able to and that lived near enough was to travel. It said in Deuteronomy they were to appear before the Lord in the place which he chooses, because at that time they were still They were still wandering at that time, so they had not settled. But of course, at the time of Jesus, this place had become the temple in Jerusalem for most Jews. And if they lived in close enough proximity, they were to travel there during these 3 pilgrimage feasts. The feast that came in the spring, March or April, was the Feast of Passover that we saw last week. And those of you that were here last year to study the book of Exodus are very familiar with that feast. We did a lot with Passover last year. And it commemorated the passing over of the angel of death over the Hebrews' houses and their subsequent deliverance from captivity in Egypt. However, it was a feast of 8 days. It was what we call an octave, and we in our liturgical calendar also have octaves. Christmas is an example. Going from Christmas Day until the Feast of the Holy Family, that 8 days is considered an octave. But it had its roots in a more ancient feast, and that was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was a festival of the spring barley and making of new flour. And one of the things they had to do is that all of the old yeast was removed from every household in preparation of making of new bread. And if you ever have the chance to go and study a little bit about the tradition of modern Jews and how they prepare for this feast, it's something called chametz. I think it's CHAMETZ, and all of the things that they go to get that old yeast, any leaven at all that's in their house, out of their house. They even take vessels that they use and put them for sale on the internet and then buy them back after the festival. They go to great lengths to make sure there's none of that old still in their house as they celebrate this feast. All of that old yeast was removed in preparation for making new bread, and last week Father Lynn did a beautiful job of telling us about bread and how significant it is in so many cultures, what an important role it plays. Well, it was at this feast that Jesus stood up and proclaimed, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger." This was a feast of harvest, of bread, and it was no accident that it was here that Jesus revealed himself as the true bread of life. The next feast that we come across, the next pilgrimage feast, is that of Pentecost. It's celebrated 50 days after Passover, so it would fall in the summer, late May, early June. This feast celebrated the wheat harvest that came in early summer, the first of the early harvest. It was also a time, though, for them to commemorate the giving of the covenant to the people at Mount Sinai, because if you remember, it was about 50 days from the time that they left Egypt to when they arrived at Mount Sinai. This feast is often called the Feast of First Fruits because it was the early harvest, or the Feast of Weeks, and the name literally means 50 days. We celebrate it, of course, today in the church as the Feast of the coming of the Holy Spirit, the birthday of the church, we call it. But in today's chapter, we find the third and the most joyous feast of the year. And as significant as it was to the Hebrews, I think it's surprising to me that we know the least about this feast. It's not as familiar to us as the other two were. This was known as the Feast of the Ingathering, or the Feast of Booths. It celebrated the fall harvest. It was the late harvest of the year. And at this time, they harvested fruit, they harvested olives, they harvested wine in the late grain festival as well. So late grain, early grain in the summer, late grain too. It was a festival of thanksgiving and of great rejoicing. There was some hesitation at the other feasts in their celebration because there was a question in their mind about what would the year be like? What would the harvest be like? Would it be abundant? Would it be sufficient for the year? But now this is the last feast of the year. The harvest has been gathered in. That's why it was the Feast of the Ingathering. And the mood was very joyous and celebratory. It was also an 8-day feast, just like they celebrated at Passover, an octave, 6 months before, and it fell late September and early October. I looked it up on the calendar to see when the feast fell for this year, and it began on October 3rd of this year. So this is something they have just celebrated about a month ago. There were some scholars that actually found the roots of our present day celebration of Thanksgiving as coming out of this festival of ingathering, of booths, or of Sukkot. You might hear it called Sukkot. Part of the ritual of this festival included prayer for the late autumn and the early winter rains, because they would prepare the fertile ground for the planting of new seeds for the next year. That would become the following year's harvest, so you can see that full cycle of the year. The feast was known as the Feast of Booths primarily, and it's what it's referred to in John, because of temporary structures that were set up, similar to thatched huts, and that's what the word Sukkot means. It means a hut, that the people erected during these 8 days. That's described in Leviticus and Nehemiah. They had you look back and kind of read some of that. The people would live in these huts for the duration of the festival, or at least they would would take their meals there, they would eat there, and they would sleep there at night. The roofs were made of this thatch that they put together of palm, myrtle, and willow branches. And they were meant to leave space so that they could see at night. When they were sleeping in that booth, they were able to see the stars at night, or they were able to see the sun during the day, or if rain were to fall during the festival, which was a great, great sign of abundance if that were to happen, that rain would fall on them too, with the little opening that they had in that thatched hut. The booths were to remind the people of two things. It was to remind them of the temporary structures that were put up by those who did the harvest. The people that did the harvest didn't have time to come home at night, so they made a temporary structure as they gathered in the fruit and the olives and the grapes that would make the wine. But it was also to remind them of the period when they wandered in the desert. They wandered in the wilderness, and their ancestors had lived in transitory housing that they had to be able to fold up and move at a moment's notice. This feast was also closely associated with two other feasts that would have taken place also during the 7th month. This was during the 7th month. The first one was Rosh Hashanah, or the New Year, which stressed the need for the people for God to restore Israel from any sins for the year ahead. It was a new year. Then the next feast was Yom Kippur, which took place 10 days later, and that was when the high priest did formal penance for the people's sins. He laid his hands then on a scapegoat, and that goat was led out into the desert to die. Well, you can see how the Feast of Sukkot that followed on the heels of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it followed just about 5 days later usually, was such a time of great rejoicing. The harvest was in, their sins had been forgiven. It was a new beginning for a new year. There were also rituals that became associated with this feast when they came to the temple to celebrate it. And these rituals were performed in the outer courts of the temple, so a lot of people were able to participate, to be able to stand there. One was a ritual of water libation, and the other was a ritual of lights. We'll return to the significance of these two in just a minute when we talk more about the feast. Well, it was to this festival that Jesus was encouraged to go by his brothers. Now, the formal understanding of the law was that anyone that lived about 15 miles or so away had to go to Jerusalem. They must go. They in Galilee were a little bit outside of this range, so he wouldn't have been breaking the law if he didn't go to the feast. But he was encouraged by his brothers to go to this feast. And just a brief word about the brothers. These relatives of Jesus are named in the book of Mark. One of them, James, goes on to become the leader of the church in Jerusalem, so we will hear more about him in the book of Acts. But the same word is often used in Hebrew, this word for brothers, to denote kinsman, a cousin, a nephew, or a half-brother. There's some scholars that even believe these might have been brothers that were sons of Joseph, maybe from a previous marriage even, that they were half-brothers of Jesus. But again, they are mentioned by name in Mark, and they were kinsmen of Jesus. His reply to these brothers is, "My time is not yet here." This echoes what we have already heard him say many times when he said, "My hour has not yet come," as he did to his mother at Cana, meaning that his death, his resurrection, and his glorification, the time was not here for that. But a different word is used here for time instead of hour. The word kairos in Greek is here meaning, it is not the appropriate time for me. Someone yesterday brought up the fact, did Jesus lie when he told his brothers he wasn't coming? But he didn't, because he said, "I'm not coming yet." He didn't say, "I'm not coming at all." He just told them, "I'm not coming yet." It is not the appropriate time for me, and he did not mislead his brothers. He tells them that he will not go up, which to them means that he will not join the pilgrimage of ascent to Jerusalem. But to us, we have an understanding of what it means about going up. It refers to his death on the cross, to his resurrection, and finally to his ascension. It is not yet time, but his brothers who have seen all of the signs do not believe in him, and they do not understand this deeper meaning. But Jesus did indeed go up to Jerusalem, and we're told that there is much debate about him when he arrives. In fact, they were looking for him at the beginning, weren't they? They were surprised that he wasn't there. They expected him to be there, but he comes in the middle of the feast. In the middle of the feast, he begins to teach. The discourse in this chapter is different from the discourse last week that we heard about the bread of life because it is constantly interrupted by questions and objections. Here we see a Johannine technique of what he calls what we know of as the double stage, where all while Jesus is teaching in the temple, the authorities, or the Jews, the religious authorities in Jerusalem, are plotting his arrest. They question his knowledge, because most rabbis of that time have spent a lot of time with a master teacher before they themselves have begun to teach. But Jesus says to them, my teaching is from God. What more of a master teacher could you have than that? They question whether or not he is the Messiah, and they talk about where he comes from. After all, some believes that when the Messiah comes that no one will know where he is from, that he will be hidden. He speaks again of the one who sent him, the Father. He has come down from heaven. Surely this would meet the criteria of a hidden origin. Later they'll go on to say, well, it says that the Messiah would be from the family of David, born in Bethlehem. Well, they may not know it, some may not know of his origins, but Jesus does fulfill all of these prophecies. What a great way for the evangelist that's writing this gospel to let us know, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. But let's return then to the Feast of Booths and what was going on and taking place around them, the reason why so many people were there, so many people had come to Jerusalem. This was a very important feast. It was during this feast that Solomon had dedicated his temple. This was the first feast, the Feast of Booths, that was celebrated in the restored temple when the people returned from exile. Zechariah, a prophet, after the exile and the restoration, spoke of this feast in light of the coming of the Messiah, the day of the Lord. To the Hebrew people, it had tremendous significance. Remember again, it was a joyous feast. It was a time of celebration for them. The harvest was in, their sins had been forgiven. They can now turn their attention to the year that lies ahead of them. They pray for rain and for another year of successful harvest. I mentioned a while back 2 rites that took place during the 8 days. One of them was of water, and one of them was of light. I'll only mention the rite of light very briefly because we will revisit it again next week as we study chapter 8. The people were told that they were to gather branches and make what they called a lulav. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but imagine the branches that we use on Palm Sunday. You know, when we come in on Palm Sunday and we're handed a branch. Well, they were to take 3 kinds of branches, a palm, a willow, and a myrtle. And they took them and they wrapped them all together and they tied them so that they had like almost like a sword-like thing that they were to wave. And they were, as they went around the altar in procession, this is what they were to wave. So imagine thousands and thousands of people walking around the altar waving these lulavs. In their left hand, they were to hold an ethrog, a citrus or a lemon-like fruit. This is known today as the 4 species, and if you look up and read about the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths, whichever, devout Jews today still gather these 4 species and make this lulav every year. At night during the festival, lights were lit in the court of women that burned so brightly that it would light up all of Jerusalem and could be seen for miles. The other rite that was observed daily was one of water in preparation for the winter rains. The book of Zechariah even has a warning that if they didn't come to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast every year, that there would be no rain for the coming year. So it was very important to them to come and to celebrate this feast. If it rained during the festival, this was seen as an assurance of abundance. And one of my readings said that even present day, people in that surrounding area watch this time of year and watch this festival to see if rain falls during those 8 days, to see that as a sign of abundance and sufficiency for the coming year. Zechariah, as I said before, speaks of this feast in connection with the triumphant day of the Lord, when Yahweh will pour out his spirit of compassion and supplication for Jerusalem. He also speaks of a fountain that opens up from the house of David to cleanse Jerusalem. This living water will flow out from Jerusalem and flow all the way to the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. Imagine that much water flowing out of Jerusalem. Raymond Brown has an account of this feast, and I am going to read just a brief portion of that about what happened during this water rite of this feast. During this feast, the prayer for rain was dramatized by a solemn ceremony. On each of the 7 mornings, a procession went down to the Fountain of Gihon on the southeast side of the Temple Hill, the fountain which supplied the waters to the pool of Siloam. There a priest filled a golden pitcher with water, as the choir repeated Isaiah 12:3. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. Any of you who have come to Easter Vigil and have seen people baptized have heard the choir sing this refrain beautifully as people are baptized. It's a beautiful thing. Then the procession, again remember, they're waving these, they went up to the temple through the water gate. The accompanying crowds carried the symbols of tabernacle. In the right hand, the lulav, which was a bunch of myrtle and willow twigs tied with palm. And in the left hand, the ethrog, which was a lemon or a citron, serving as a sign of the harvest. All along they were singing psalms as they came. When they reached the altar of holocaust in front of the temple, they proceeded around the altar, waving the lulavs and singing psalms. Then the priest went up the ramp to the altar to pour the water into a silver funnel where it flowed into the ground. So think in terms of that river of water that's flowing from the altar all the way out from Jerusalem. On the 7th day, which was the greatest day of the feast, they marched around the altar, not 1 time, but 7 times. So this was repeated 7 times as they marched around the altar, and the water was poured on the altar 7 times. It was at this moment, this solemn moment, that Jesus stood up in the temple and proclaimed that he was the source of living waters. Their prayers for water had indeed been answered, but in a way that they did not expect. Living water flowing out of Jerusalem. We heard previously in chapter 3, we heard of a prophecy or a vision from the book of Ezekiel that spoke of a river of living water that flowed out from under the temple. We see that river in the book of Revelation coming from the throne of God. Jesus now declares that these rivers of living water would flow from his own body, the new temple. We will see this again when his side is pierced by a lance at the crucifixion and blood and water flow forth. We are reminded again of the story from Exodus that we read last year of living water that flowed from a rock. This is seen now as a foreshadowing of Jesus as the source of living water. It is, as we talked quite a bit about last year, the New Testament concealed in the Old, and the Old Testament revealed in the New. We are told then in verse 39 that this living water is the Spirit. We are told in our catechism that Christ, the Anointed One, once he is glorified, can in turn send the Spirit to all those who believe in him. Water is a powerful symbol of the Spirit and his action in baptism. Once Jesus has been glorified through his death and resurrection, he will communicate the fullness of the Spirit to the whole Messianic people, to you and to me. Water and the Spirit. Where have we heard this before? It is no accident that Nicodemus shows up again at the end of this chapter. The one who came to Jesus in secret at night. The one who was told then, you must be born of water and the Spirit. Now at the end of this great festival of light and of water, he comes openly now to defend Jesus before the Sanhedrin by saying, does our law condemn a person before it hears him and finds out what he is doing? I am the bread come down from heaven. He who eats of me shall not hunger. I am the living water. He who believes in me shall not thirst. Jesus came to fulfill the law. Jesus came to fulfill the feast. He came to reveal himself in the symbols that the people knew so well. He came to fulfill the feast and to replace them with himself. He comes to us today, but do we always recognize him? Sometimes in the people that come before us and the people that we serve. Do we recognize him in the ins and outs and the daily routines of our lives? Sometimes our eyes aren't open to see the light of the world, the bread come down from heaven, the living water that's right before us. The book of Revelation says this, behold, I make all things new. This is what Jesus came to do, to fulfill this and make all things new. May our own eyes be open to see the Messiah in our own lives, into those around us, and to respond in joy. And I asked Peggy if she would, as we close in prayer today, if she would sing the refrain once again from that beautiful song of Sacred Silence. So I'll ask her to do that, and then we'll close in prayer. Do you want that? Okay.